Well, good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. Not sure it's a pleasure to be going first, but anyway. As you can see, we've got an excellent panel here representing developers, representing those who provide finance, and also representing, if you like, the more, some might say, objective view of life from the academic community in Tony. I don't know whether you saw recently that the group of people who are the most trusted by Britons are actually academics. Interesting. Perhaps it is that we genuinely believe they can be independent. I don't know, Tony, whether you saw that one, but probably not. But so what we'll try and do is address a few of these issues in this first session. It's very much about what do people see as being the principal characteristics that made London a leading city. We saw what everybody thinks in the room just now about that. How does it stand against other cities, existing challenges, current appeal that London has to new occupiers, and is there such a thing as a brand? And what is it about the London brand? I'll start, if I may, with Colette O'Shea, Head of Development at Landsec. Colette, is London unique? Are there any particular aspects to it which you would pick out?
Well, I think, well, we've heard that London is unique. We've heard that it's maintaining its place as a global city, and it's maintained that sort of position against New York consistently. I think that Ben has picked out a lot of the sort of characteristics, but maybe one that's my area of expertise I'll just talk about is the property side. And one of the fundamental factors is that the infrastructure he's referring to is not just about the railways and the power, etc. It is about the buildings that we're providing. And we're actually pretty good in London at providing what people need. Over the last 30 years, the cost of occupying property have fallen by nearly 50%. Occupancy cost as a percentage of the wage bill has gone from 20% in the 70s to 10% today. And whilst on the face of it, people think that our rents per square foot are high, we actually are pretty good at packing people in. That's the sort of environment that we're happy to work with in London, so that at a sort of desk-based cost, we're very competitive.
Right, so we're very competitive. And does everybody agree that the cost of renting their office is very low? Right.
Didn't say that.
Competitive. Right, Martin, the Managing Director of Prudential Property Investment, Martin Moore. What is it about the nature of investment in London? And we read in the FT this morning, I noticed that London has attracted 30% of all the investment which has come into Europe in recent years, in the last 12 months, I think, has actually come into London. Why is that?
Well, let me give you my thoughts. As a born and bred Londoner, you know, I think emotionally London is by far the greatest city in the world. But as an investor and as a global investor, you know, I have to be very dispassionate in the decisions that I take. My role is to build portfolios of real estate in this country and around the world that perform consistently well. So I have to be dispassionate rather than emotional in my choices. If we look back over the last 20 or 30 years, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the investors we see at the moment active in the market, the behaviours and the observations come in very clear phases or waves. So we would have had in the 80s, we'd have had a significant focus on London from money from Japan, the life companies in Japan. We've seen waves of capital from America, from German open-ended funds, from Scandinavia. But today, undoubtedly, the investment in London is dominated by two particular types of investors, and they are largely based out in the Middle and the Far East. The two sort of broad categories I'm referring to, of course, are the sovereign wealth funds and the cash-rich, the cash surplus pension funds. And the drivers are, I think, enduring drivers. The majority of the sovereign wealth funds are enjoying earnings from commodities, particularly from oil and gas. More than half are dependent on revenues from oil and gas. Those that aren't are in economies enjoying very strong trade surpluses. And the pension funds are either being influenced by regulatory change, we've seen in Australia, or by just very strong demographics, which we would observe out of Korea and Malaysia, both of whom have been active in buying in this country. So lots of, if you like, push factors, and undoubtedly London is a huge magnet. It is pivotal in the world stage from a real estate investment point of view. 14% of all activity throughout Europe, investment, as John was saying, is represented by London. Again, comes in waves, but back in the early 1990s, 70% of activity in London was international activity. It would have dipped over the intervening period, but if we look back over the last 2 or 3 years, we are getting back to those numbers today. So about 70%. Why is that? 3 or 4, 5 perhaps main factors that I think influence investor behaviour. It is one of the most transparent markets in the world. From a real estate point of view, it is data rich, it is transparent in a way that many other markets are opaque and data poor. It's a large market and it's a very liquid market. It is the most liquid market in Europe. If we look over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen 3 times as much transaction activity in London than Paris, and 10 times the activity compared to Frankfurt. So it is large, it is liquid. It is seen, and we heard from Ben earlier, it is seen as a safe haven, a global financial centre, and perceived to continue to be a dominant global financial centre. Currency, non-euro, sterling, another sort of push-pull, particularly given many investors will see sterling being relatively good value, relatively cheap today. The individual lot sizes in London, again, are significantly higher than in Europe. In the last 3 years, there have been over 100 transactions at 100 million euros or more, which makes it a fairly efficient market from an investor's point of view to enter. The legal system we've heard talk about, so there are many pulls, I think, that will influence London as a very attractive centre for global capital. If I may close just with a balancing comment, and this is going back to my dispassionate, so putting my dispassionate hat on. Whilst it has many great attributes, London is also, in the office market particularly, it is also one of the most volatile markets in the world, and as an investor that would temper my view of London. So if we look at the 60 top cities around the world, in 2011, just take 2011, the median market, the median country, the median city was Seoul in South Korea. There were only 4 European countries last year that were above that median, and London was one of those. But if we look back over 10 years, the London market is, as I say, other than Dublin, it is the most volatile commercial market in the whole of Europe. So whilst there are many attractions, as a dispassionate investor, that volatility would definitely influence and temper my behaviour. And a little bit of evidence of that, two final closing comments. If we look at data from IPD, who measure sort of the UK property market in many ways. If we look at the annual index, back in 1981, London, made up of the City, West End and Midtown, would have represented 35% of that annual index, made up of funds and property companies and so on. Today, that number would be, 30 years on, would be half, would be 18%. Or another way of looking at it, there is a survey done each year sponsored by Development Securities called Who Owns London? And in 1980, domestic ownership of London was over 90%. Today, that number is less than 50%. And I can see that trend inexorably continuing in the years ahead.
All right, thank you, Martin. Right, next, Chris Grigg, CEO of British Land. I guess Seoul might be considered to be a stable place by the very nature of its government. I mean, Chris, here, do you see differing roles in terms of central government, local government, and the impact that that has on London?
Yes, I do. I think that from the perspective of the investors we talk to, it is clear that the stability, not just of government, but of the legal system, and the sense that you will be treated the same in this country, whether you're domestic or international, puts us in quite an unusual position. If you do the thought experiment of where else in the world that is true, you tend to come up with a very, very short list, and much shorter than people generally realise. So I think that's just a big single advantage that we have, which obviously relates in part to government. I think the second thing that is very important, and we've talked about how many different things relate to London's strength, but it is clear that the work that government has done in the last few years on transportation has made an enormous difference. And I think if you look at in particular the investment that has gone into the tubes, the buses, and the overground one way and another, it's been phenomenal. I think the effect of Crossrail will be substantial, not just to individual parts of London, but clearly just increasing the speed of flow in what will become a more complicated and burdened system. I think the other thing we think a lot about is the planning system, and I think as developers it is relatively easy for us to get grumpy about the planning system. The truth, of course, is that over time, one of the attractions of London is precisely that sense of place, is precisely that diversity, and like it or not, the planning system has been a big creator of that. In that context, you know, more than half of British Land's business is outside the capital, and be careful what you wish for. London planners have their issues, but if we look at our ability to get things done here and compare it with the degree of difficulty in some other parts of the country, this town feels okay, and I think that's important. I think the other thing that what we have to recognise in that broader context is that government plays an incredibly important role going forward. They get a lot of things right, but it also means there is enormous pressure on government going forward to get some of these things right. And if we think about the questions and all of our answers to those questions, you realise how much is on government's plate in the next few years. You know, you just think about airport capacity, and I do worry about the fact, not so much that we might not end up with a third runway, but that for political reasons, that decision, which feels very necessary, is being obfuscated into the next Parliament. And it's those sorts of things which seem to me will never increment on their own stop this city being where it is in the world, but certainly if you have enough poor decisions from government which is so central to this success, then you start to fret about where we're going.
Thank you, Chris. Tony, Chris has started to open up some of the concerns going forward. We've heard a lot of positive stuff from ourselves this morning in terms of the earlier exam questions that we were set. Is it as good as it seems, or are there indeed many reasons to be concerned?
I don't know many reasons to be concerned, but there are certainly, I think there's always, it's always necessary to keep alert to the threats to any big city, particularly when you consider the competition that other major cities in Europe, North America, and of course developing cities are able to invest in themselves, particularly in the developing world, very fast in order to make those places more attractive, more desirable relatively. Now, of course, London has been extremely good at surviving Britain's relative economic decline over a very long period, and there's no evidence at the moment that it won't continue to do that, but there are, and they've all been mentioned already this morning, but just to list them again. I mean, I think the issue of immigration policy is profoundly important to London. It isn't just that immigration has allowed people at all parts of the labour market to come here and to provide skills which perhaps for whatever reasons weren't as easily available as they should have been, but the whole brand and the image of London is of an open city which is accessible to people, people can come here to work, to live, part of their life come and go. And I think changing that impression would be profoundly damaging. So it's for two reasons. One is the skill accessibility, the other is the city's image. And you only have to look at them in a self-interested point, but the barriers being put to international students coming to study in London, to see what are going to, how it's hard to think of how many different ways that undermines our long-term competitiveness. And the point's just been made by Chris about airport policy, though Joe Valentine mentioned it earlier. There's no doubt that the unspeakably slow decision-making process that there always is with these big issues, energy policy, airports, defence procurement, whatever it is bad. It's bad for business, and it's also simply bad for the city's long-term future. We can have another review, we are having another review of airport policy, but the truth is, in the end, somebody just needs to make a decision. It's not that complicated. Either you build one extra runway at Heathrow, or a new airport is constructed, and that's a massive project, Olympic style, and that can be done as well. But a decision needs to be made. I think beyond the airport, infrastructure more generally, and although there has been a big investment in transport infrastructure in recent years, the point about the population growth cannot be understated. London's population is growing at the rate of about, if you think of it, perhaps a borough every 3 or 4 years. And so the population will rise to 9 million by 2020 and 10 million by 2030. This is adding Birmingham to London every decade, in effect. And to do that will require not just, obviously, airport and tube-type capacity, but primary schools and basic infrastructure and the telecoms and gas and electricity utilities infrastructure that allow a city to densify at that rate. And if we don't get that right, then we'll end up with problems that make the city much less attractive to live in. I think there are other issues, I won't go into detail about these, that the city always has to bear in mind. Housing has been mentioned, and the risk from time to time of eccentric tax decisions. I mean, I think I totally am voted for the stability of Britain's political system, a huge advantage. No political extremism really in Britain, a very stable environment, whatever you say about the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, all run by people who by international standards look quite good. So, I name no names from other countries, but, hey, these people are... But there is always the risk of some stupid tax decision that will sort of send a ripple out across the rest of the world that would be very bad for a city that is as open as London. And my last point is that, of course, at events like this, which are London-focused, it is perfectly reasonable to see all London's strengths and advantages. And there are lots of cranes on the skyline, which I'm never sure is a good or a bad sign. Others in the city will know that. But lots, central and inner London are developing a pace. But the rest of the UK is not in such a good position. And I don't think we can detach London and the South East from the rest of the UK without a damaging political reaction to that over time. So in London, we have to think about how London is contributing to growth elsewhere in the UK. And indeed, we have to be alert to the fact that politicians can't let the rest of the UK fall behind too far. So again, we've got to work with politicians to understand London's importance, but also not to leave the rest of the UK out.
Could I just start by making one observation from Tony's there, which is this growth in population. Clearly such a rapid growth in population must, I would have thought, place very significant challenges, particularly in housing, but also in the other facilities which Tony has mentioned. We've given a fairly soft ride, it seems, so far today to the planning process, but if in fact we are going to deal with such a rapid increase in population, question to all of you, is the planning process as good as it's been made out to be today, or are there real concerns and issues that need to be addressed? Colette?
Well, I think as Chris said, you know, we all get very frustrated with the planning process, and day to day it can get very sort of painful. But one of the things we must remember is that what makes London a global city is its whole sort of livability factor, and that is, and I think Ben slightly glossed over it, but it's this the fact that we do retain our culture, we do respect our culture, so the viewing corridors, etc., are there for a purpose. And I think it's a good thing, because I think without them we will become like any other city. We seem to have got the balance between the heritage and the modern. I suppose where the planning system possibly can help is in being more flexible. I think the policies are there to allow flexibility, but it's how they're generally sort of interpreted. And I think it was quite interesting in one of the questions about housing and public-private sector working. And it may not necessarily be that the public sector has to bring cash, but it's that they bring their requirement against a private developer who's having to provide affordable housing as well. So there's a great sort of collaboration there. I think the whole thing about schools, roads, it's really a recognition that there's only so much the developments can sustain in terms of their Section 106 packages. So are we and the local authorities clear about what the priorities are? And in some places they are different priorities, and I think there needs to be much more focus on working out and much more flexibility about specific areas. What's important? Is it the school? Is it the road? Is it the housing? And at the moment it tends to be just, this is the rule, it's going to be the housing, that's it.
Chris?
I agree completely with that. I think the other thing in that space where we have a problem is, well, clearly there are a whole number of boroughs in London, and the expertise you see in different boroughs is different, and the application of rules is different. That doesn't make anybody's life easier, particularly those people who might want to operate across more parts of London. I think the other thing, which is in the let's just at least try and stop getting in our own ways, is that the imposition of CIL on top of Section 106, when that wasn't really the original intention, or at least that wasn't how it was sold, risks simply creating another tax on development. And the truth is, as many of the people on this platform, people in this room know, development's quite hard to justify right now, and if you add another tax to it, it just gets harder still. So I think that is, it's right now it feels like a bad tax, it feels like an ill thought out combination of tax airs. There's a big pressure from the BPF and others to try and alter that, but that is something where specifically there's a capacity, not just in London, to get in our own way here and make development harder. And I think that would be an important, pro or con, depending on how it plays out literally in the weeks and months ahead.
I believe the government has actually today made some new announcements about planning. We do seem to get a lot of announcements today, some of them not always expected by other government departments, but we'll move on from that one. Can I open it up to the floor? And if in fact you have questions or observations that you'd like to make about the things which we've been discussing today, and if you could just say who you are and what your background is, just to put your remarks in context. Anybody going to be first? Always somebody has to be first. Can we see anyone? Yes, the lady over here in pink, on table 7.
I think is really pressing is we've got a consensus in the room, and certainly from the speakers, as to what makes London great and competitive, and I think a very scary reality about the growth being a positive. The scariness is actually, can we move fast enough to deliver to meet that growth? And I think it would be interesting to have a comment about what's going to make that happen. Is it political will, political planning, a private sector drive and energy connected to political will, and how that adds up at a London level and possibly at a East London level, given the conversations about where we think growth is going to occur. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Yes, political will. It's said, of course, about the Olympics, and I've said it many times, that it was the consensus of political will which actually drove that, and very, very unusual. And so politics is very much at the centre of what we're trying to do. Panel. Chris.
Yeah, look, I think there's no question that we have, in this space, in a lot of ways, we've made things difficult for ourselves. So, for example, localism is something that I personally think is a good plan. The idea that people close to where stuff's getting done should have a view, that view ought to be better than people far away, has always seemed to me kind of sensible and a good tenet of democracy. What it does do is slow things down. And we talked to government right at the beginning of this spell and said, look, what you will find is this is going to slow things down. And it was that, no it won't, it'll be okay. The kind of complete belief that if you will something, then hopefully it'll work out right. And of course it didn't. And now, 2.5 years on, we're trying to row back, it would appear, from localism and its consequences. So it's that sort of thing, I think, which is one of the factors in the way of things speeding up. Having said that, it does feel, albeit in a slightly confused manner, that government is focused on trying to speed things up. But we've probably lost 2 years at least in a period of slow growth where things that make sense and would add growth and would add jobs right around the country, not necessarily just here or indeed anywhere else, and these supply chains mean that the knock-on effects are pretty considerable nowadays, aren't getting done. And that, I think, is just something that government is unequivocally, in our experience, much more focused than they were even 6 months ago. But there's still a difference between being focused and getting things done.
Colette?
I think one of the really important things is the short term now, because Boris is going around at the moment talking about his 2020 vision, which is absolutely right. But the message that we're giving to him is that, well, by 2020 we'll be done and dusted with virtually everything that we've currently dealing with. And we need to be focused on the here and the now. And I think one of the points, and it came out again in Ben's, is that within London, within the UK, we don't actually recognise what we have in London. The rest of the world does, but we don't. And I do feel that there needs to be a bit of a sort of rallying cry, not even a sort of regulatory matter, but a rallying cry by the mayor behind the local authorities that becomes a sort of education. We heard from Ben's stuff as well that a lot of people don't really know the facts, they're not really clear on what's going on. And it feels that with that, we may get the impetus, because it would then help us with the localism, the consultation, etc., etc. So it doesn't seem difficult, but there doesn't seem, that baton hasn't been sort of picked up yet.
Tony?
Well, I mean, the planning system, of course, is to some extent about rationing. I mean, it's always about rationing space, rationing what's here now. And of course we've got these very powerful demands generated by growth in population, but where we also have other political demands for constraints on the use of green land. So London is hemmed in, and there isn't only growth in London, but there's equivalent growth in the east and the southeast regions around London. And this is going to feed growth back into the city. And I do think that inevitably planning, and given that all planning decisions in the end are political as well as being about rationing, that planners are going to have to be more directive over time in order to drive up densities and the way in which land is developed. Now, I know that planners, in a sense, can only react to what comes to them, but I think there is going to have to be slightly more directedness from the top if 1 million, then another 1 million people, and all the workspaces that come with that, are to be housed in reasonable comfort. It has to be planned, and London's planning system is notoriously a sort of fragmented, slightly competitive, good for those who are in it, more difficult perhaps to get into, and so on. And I think the whole thing will have to be, on the one hand, slightly more directive to driving up the amount of development, but on the other hand, more easily accessible to developers to get things done quickly. I mean, these are huge. I mean, you know, we've already got the beds in sheds problem, you know, people living in what are kind of London's version of shanty towns in parts of outer London. And for that to be stopped and reversed, and some boroughs are stopping and reversing it, that'll create more demand for conventional housing and, you know, the risk of greater homelessness. And, you know, that will require top-down activity by government fast.
Martin?
Not a lot to add, and we haven't been as active as developers in London over the last few years in anything like the degree that both Land Securities and British Land have been. But it seems to me that there is more uncertainty today around the application of the planning environment and framework than there has perhaps ever been, and that uncertainty creates delays, as Tony is saying. So the greater, going back to the question, the greater the certainty there can be, the greater the clarity, and the greater the speed of decision making, the better that is for the people writing the checks, the sources of capital, and that will be an encouragement to get involved in this activity. Uncertainty equals risk, which is a deterrent rather than an attraction.
Thank you. Lady at the back, is it a lady waving her hand? Yes.
Hi, Liz Peace, Chief Executive of the British Property Federation. I'm very interested in how we pay for all this infrastructure that we see we need. There was a fairly sort of glib sort of finding in Ben's survey, the public sector should invest in the housing we need, and I think Ben said quite sensibly, well, the public sector reckons it's broke at the moment, although it can find money for certain things. How do we somehow or other try and channel this investment that Martin was talking about? He mentioned the sovereigns, he mentioned the pension funds. How could we get them to actually see investment in infrastructure as worthwhile? How do we sort of package the infrastructure needs in such a way that we can harness this sort of wall of money that's actually looking for a safe haven? And indeed, is that the way to fund the infrastructure rather than expecting government to pay for it?
Yes, very topical and question. I don't know whether other people have seen, as I have recently, the fact that IMF and others are now observing that austerity, by and large, across the world does not work. And there is a strong Keynesian sort of push which is coming forward. But it seems to me that most politicians are very reluctant to acknowledge that because, as we're seeing in America, you then get accused of tax and spend. But you can borrow money more cheaply today than for a very, very long time. And many would argue that it would seem a sensible point for the public sector to, in fact, invest and not solely rely on private. But, Tony?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really important question because there isn't going to be public money. I mean, it's not unique to Britain, but Britain is a country where whenever there is austerity or the need for cutting public spending, capital spending gets cut furthest and fastest. And that's kind of mad, but that's the way it's always done. And we know, and many of the people in this room know this better than me, that private capital investment into London, foreign direct investment, is possible. Lots of money is invested in property in London, residential and commercial. But it's much more difficult to invest in major projects, and the reason for that is that any major project, even many minor projects, have to be started from scratch. And I think the lesson of the Olympics is, with a massive political will, it's true with public money, but frankly, if it had been private money, it probably could have been, in different market conditions, more it could have been done with private money, because the will was there for the project to happen. Compulsory purchase, just things happened. They had to happen. And I think the difficulty with investing in what we think of normally as public infrastructure, trying to get private money into it, is that for the investor, you just arrive in Britain and then you're told, well, go and talk to the transport department, or you'll have to make the case for your own project. And Crossrail is being built, and that's a very good thing. I was always a supporter of Crossrail. But think of the efforts that had to be made by London First and the full lobby behind them to get all the way through the processes, the planning, 2 sets of parliamentary processes, one of which failed. In the end, the money had to be brought together in a tortured way over a very long time. Now, if you were to say to some sovereign investment corporation, you should invest in that kind of project, then it's just too slow to make it work. So government, and only government, can create the kind of vehicles for projects to go ahead, sort of public infrastructure projects, into which money can be fed. And on final point, selling off the high-speed one rail line was fine because it was there to be bought, and there was foreign investment in that very easily. But that's because it was already there. And it's so difficult, I think, for investment to get into these projects because, in a sense, each one has to start from zero, and the people with the money are then put under pressure to develop the project.
Martin?
Liz, I think it's, as Tony said, it's all about the delivery mechanisms. In a world of prospective returns that are much more subdued, looking forward, than perhaps we have enjoyed over the last decade or two, and if you believe in rational markets, private capital is there to invest, provided there is a way for it easily to invest. So, funds that we're involved with, or that I've seen others, we have invested in water companies, we've invested in British ports, we've invested in the Dartford toll bridge. So when there is a delivery mechanism that is plausible and credible, private capital will be attracted, but it won't if it has to start right at the starting line of the 100-metre or the marathon that it's more likely to be. And in a similar way, I think you mentioned residential, and will we see private capital or institutional capital getting involved in the residential market? It was a big theme from Ben's earlier presentation. And my belief is that we are at a tipping point. If we were to go back 30 or 40 years, immediately after the Second World War, there was a big institutional investment in the residential market in this country, and it was only the interference of government and the introduction of rent tax and sort of a meddling that began to interfere with the returns that caused that capital, because returns were being diminished, to move elsewhere. I believe now we're at a tipping point. The rented market is going to look very different into the future forever than it has been over the recent past. Even though the aspirations of ownership are still there, the reality is going to be very different. And I think this sector is demonstrating a whole range of features that are increasingly attractive to organisations like mine and long-term capital from this country and abroad. So I believe, as a prediction, in the next 5 years, you will see the emergence of rented residential as a mainstream investment class in a way that we haven't seen for 50 years. So watch this space, but I believe that will become a reality.
Colette?
Yeah, I mean, I've got sort of direct experience of working with LUL, HS1, Thames Water, UKPN, and there is no consistency at all in terms of approach, how they're regulated. For some of them, their own regulations prohibit investment. So there's definitely something at the sort of national level that makes them more user-friendly and be open to investment propositions. Secondly, I come back to the point I made about the planning process. I have seen examples of where, through the planning process, you can successfully invest in infrastructure, but that's where the decision has been taken that infrastructure must take a priority over affordable housing or a school, and that is where we need to be taking the decisions. There are also other areas where, can more development be created? Are we prepared to go that extra height in order to pay for a railway, etc.? And there are examples where it hasn't worked. So I think the planning policy framework is flexible enough to address that, but there needs to be the political will to actually do it.
Chris, so this is particularly on how is it paid for? I mean, should it be more public money or public underwriting, perhaps, private investment?
It feels to me like, a bit like the conversation about London itself, there's unlikely to be one silver bullet in this space. If I look at some of the good news, then I think in an environment of very low interest rates, which most people would expect to go on for some time in at least of the Western world or the developed world, if you look at the development of sovereign wealth funds, some of whom have extraordinarily long time horizons, then in that environment there is a natural willingness from some of those funds, as well as other pools of capital, to invest in infrastructure projects. But it is the ability to make that a commercial proposition that is just a hard thing to do. And in this country, as we know, there is a degree of disquiet at quite grassroots levels of, you know, paying for roads by tolls or whatever. And somehow or other, you've got to find a way of creating a return that feels certain enough, both in timing and return terms, to attract money in. And if we can't do that, and this is not something I think is particularly easy for politicians, because my sense is it comes quite viscerally from people in this country, then it's very hard to create something that's going to work. But should we? Yes. Can we? Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's two over there.
Two over here.
Hello?
Yep.
John Walker, Westminster City Council Planning. I've got to say there's a certain word that's been shoved down everybody's throats for the last 10 years I've been going to conferences, but I have to congratulate you, you're the second one in the month I've been to, where the word hasn't really been mentioned so far: sustainability. It's been a massive focus for the last 10 years. There are issues of overheating in our cities, clean air. I think they are going to be very, very big factors if London is going to maintain its place on the global agenda, because I think investors want to see clean and cities that are not overheating and have got good air quality, for example. But it's not been mentioned yet, and I'm slightly surprised of all the questions put forward. There's nothing about people's perceptions on the greenness of London. Is that an indicator that sustainability is being pushed onto the back burner?
Excellent question. Colette?
I think it's probably because it's almost a given now. And therefore it's not something that we necessarily are talking about day in, day out, because it's embedded in everything we're doing. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it is now moving up the agenda of investors. It is moving up the agenda of occupiers. You have clear sort of expectations, and so it's almost a case of, well, if that isn't ticked, then we'll move on and we'll look at another building. I think it forms part of the whole livability of London, which is, you know, what makes people want to actually live here. I think one of the problem areas that we are still facing is, in practical levels, how can we actually meet our aspirations? You know, we've got great plans, the government set targets, etc. But the targets were sort of set without working out how at a sort of technical level we could sort of achieve all this. So I agree. I think it's, well, for me, I think it's an absolute given. But I think the technical delivery and where we want to get to is still, you know, work in progress. I think people are operating at the highest level they can, but it's probably not, we're not in the perfect world at the moment.
Anybody else? Martin?
I think I would absolutely agree with Colette that the reason perhaps we haven't spoken about it, or it hasn't featured, is that that it is now sort of a well and truly established consideration in everything we do. Call it sustainability or socially responsible investment, as we would tend to capture it today. But be it in determining how we develop, what we invest in, what our occupier tenants are looking for as a product service from us, it is a fundamental part of our day-to-day lives. And I think that's perhaps why we've taken it for granted and haven't mentioned it as you might have expected.
I think there is another level of issues too, which is if you look at new developments, then we would hold ourselves to very high standards in terms of the greenness of the buildings, both in terms of how they actually operate and obviously meeting the various accreditations we need to do. It is still, if I look at British Land's own experience, then the greatest savings in energy we've achieved on the estate in in the course of the last couple of years have been very simple things, which have included you know, putting better metering in and then having a bloke who walks around and turns the central heating down and vice versa. And so, and by the way, it is very, very difficult to get a lot of tenants interested in that thing. So the tenants who will insist on very high status buildings when they arrive do not necessarily have that much interest in operating them at the standards to which they have been designed. And by the way, I'll let you into a secret, government is not great in that space. It's probably not a secret by the sound of it, but so, you know, when I walk past a government building and seeing that you can clearly see from space in the middle of the night because all the lights are still on, I scratch my head about sustainability targets. But it's not just government, we know that. So I think that really embedding it into how people behave as opposed to a little bit of a box-ticking exercise is a big deal. And I think the whole retrofitting issue is enormous. I mean, I just walked, our offices are at the bottom of the Edgware Road, and I just walked up here, and you look at the stock of buildings on this road, and it's pretty ordinary. And you think about how inefficient I am sure those buildings are, and the energy that we have saved in our two developments down at the bottom, you know, is, I suspect, absolutely dwarfed by what's going on in the next, you know, 250 metres up the Edgware Road.
Yes, I sat on a panel not so long ago on this with government, where in fact, of course, the key observation was that 80% of our stock is still going to be there in 20 years' time. And in fact, it is that existing stock which is the massive challenge when it comes to energy usage. I remember the first time I went to the Scottish Parliament, and we went into a meeting room and we all sat down, and within about 2 minutes all the lights went out. And there was no switch on the wall. And in the end we worked out that somebody had to get up and rush around, and then the lights came back on again. So technology solves it in the end. But I would take, personally, I would take issue with Colette about the setting a target without knowing what the technology is to deliver, because my argument as an engineer has been that that is what is missing, is if government actually is prepared to set clear objectives over a time frame, then industry and engineering will respond. And in fact, it can be a terrific driver for innovation by actually setting benchmarks and saying that's where we want to get to. Without those targets, there is a danger, in fact, that I would argue, you slow down the innovative process, particularly in areas such as property. But there was another question, I think.
Sorry, I'm afraid to say it's also Westminster. Rosemary McQueen, I'm the Strategic Director for the Built Environment. And just in terms of retrofitting, just to say that we have actually produced an SPD on retrofitting in conjunction with both University of Westminster, academia, but also with businesses, a lot of whom are in this room, because we know with conservation areas there's still going to be a lot of retrofitting in order to produce those kind of energy dividends. But my question was actually to do with the honeymoon period that we're likely to see in terms of relaxation. I haven't seen exactly what the government has said today about change of use of offices to residential, but also about sovereign investment. I was fascinated by the voting pattern, which seems to suggest I won't have any applications to deal with soon because they'll all be in the East End, which isn't quite what I feel, having been, I'm glad to say, in our little Westminster bubble in the last 3 years. Application workload rate has gone up 10% each year. So that's a healthy sign for the economy. But within that, and in a very short space of time, there has been a quite radical change in the number of change of use and redevelopment applications for residential. That might sound okay, although I would say for the future balance of the city, I would be deeply unhappy if there was a period where we weren't looking for mixed residential use, which includes affordable housing. But that's what we're beginning to see. And we're also beginning to see almost an international timeshare aspect to the residential that's being built. Most people in this room would not be able to afford the prices of these flats, and in fact the lights are out, sustainably, let's say, perhaps for 80% of the year. Does that actually mean that we're building a city bearing in mind that most of the international firms are still located within Westminster and want to be here for the balance of life that they see. Will we have a city that's safe if there aren't quite so many people walking around in the streets? Will we have the local newsagents, etc., still being able to provide business if they actually only have residents here for a little while? So it's an interesting aspect of what's happening within Westminster and also RBKC as well. And I'd like to see whether you're happy, therefore, to see residential being built at whatever value without any affordable or any other component within it for a few years, because it actually means jobs in the construction industry.
Mixed development, more affordable. Tony?
I mean, I do think it is clearly an important challenge to London, because, I mean, if there were to be, and I mean, others in the room know much more about this than me, but on the balance of rate of return for residential versus commercial development, I can see that there would be a shift, a substantial shift potentially from business use to residential use in the centre of the city, perhaps beyond the centre of the city, and then reinforced by the fact that there's hot money flowing into the country to buy new residential property. Now, these two things can be seen as good, they're signs of London's openness, but I mean, the thing that makes London London is the extraordinary agglomeration of activities in the city centre, particularly business activities. And, you know, there's an established academic literature about agglomeration benefits, the productivity that brings with it, and the fact that that requires epic concentration to make it work. So I do think there's a big planning issue here, and the challenge, I guess, is to sustain at least as many, as it were, workplaces in inner and central London, while allowing development of residential properties to go ahead. And then there's the separate issue of whether or not, and normally the answer to this question has been no, there's anything public policy should do about the ownership of such property. Does it matter that the property is increasingly owned by people who don't live there? Well, we've generally taken an entirely laissez-faire view, which I don't think is necessarily true in other comparable cities. So, for example, in New York, I understand patterns of condominium and cooperative ownership make it more difficult for people to buy into developments and never live there. So, but these are, so I'm just agreeing with you in a sort of complicated way. I think it's a challenge, and not one that we have that many tools, and certainly the government, if anything, is encouraging it without really knowing what the long-term consequences would be for the city economy.
Colette?
I think you're right in that if we end up with a city where the lights are turned off in the residential units, I think that would be complete sort of failure. I think on the positives that we need to think about are that with the private housing that is being developed, affordable housing is being developed in parallel. The reality is how many of those units are actually empty, because in our experience, the development we've just recently completed, the units are being rented out. They're not just sitting there as investments, so they're providing a rental space, which is obviously one of the things on the original questions. And, we do need the investment in the UK at the moment.
I think there's another very important issue here, which oddly enough is a non-London issue. And I think this is an example of where London can have the wrong impact on broader issues. The need to change use in towns and cities right across the UK is enormous. You only have to walk through those towns and cities to see how many empty offices there are, how many empty shops there are, changes of behaviour, changes of the way that people are running their businesses around the country mean that there's much less need for regional offices, it feels like, and there's much less need for central town and city shopping compared with what was true a decade or two ago. And in those towns and cities, over-rigid planning, in our view, is one of the reasons why you can't move forward. And those issues broadly are quite distinct from central London issues, and both have a place. And I think if the government is addressing those broadly out of London issues, I think that's a very good thing, and that we will have to figure out some of the local implications back here.
We've got 2 or 3 minutes before it's time for coffee. Any more questions out there? Final question from anybody? Yes, right in the centre.
Thanks. Alan Pepper, I'm Chief Executive of Vanta. There's been quite a lot of talk about political will to change things. It strikes me that political will is a factor of the population's view. And if you just take the airport expansion issue, I live in southwest London. If there's a 3rd runway in Heathrow, there's probably 3 Tory MPs who lose their seats. And I wonder what, and I guess it's the same with HS2 and a number of these other big infrastructure which are important for the development of the city. I wonder if the panel has a view to what extent we, the industry, can stop just talking to politicians and actually persuade the city and its population that these things need to happen. And in my case, if 3rd runway is the right idea, I'm just going to have to live with more flights.
Tony?
I mean, it's a very interesting question because I think the opposition to Heathrow, or the expansion of Heathrow, and to some extent the opposition to its existing functioning, has led to a position where senior politicians, not least of which the Mayor of London, want to have an entirely new airport on the east of the city, which would mean, other things being equal, no need for a hub airport at Heathrow and presumably the closure of Heathrow Airport. Now, whether the grassing over of Heathrow and the loss of all those jobs and the fall in house prices that could come with it would be popular in West London, I somehow doubt. So I actually think that those who live in West London do need to think increasingly harder about whether their opposition could lead to substantial economic detriment. You know, if Heathrow closed, it would be like the docks. The impact on West London would be like the docks closing on East London. Just that we've never got over that. And it's still, despite everything that's gone on at Canary Wharf, East London's never recovered from the decline of the industrial base there. And that, I think, is the risk that those living in West London have now created for themselves. And I think pushing some of the negatives for West London of Heathrow closing is, something that will begin to make people think differently.
Anybody else on the reality of the politics, and how does the reality of the politics get in the way of what you're trying to do at the end of the day?
I think it's really what I was saying earlier about needing this rallying cry that's, sort of galvanising the boroughs, that's galvanising us within the industry, the construction industry, etc., the academics, so that we do start giving out one message, we start explaining what we're doing, we start explaining that it's not all bad, what are the positives and negatives. And, I think that is something, that's why we have a mayor, that's why we voted the mayor, it's almost him demonstrating the leadership. And I think that's, that's my sort of view on the politics of it.
Tony, again?
I mean, I don't disagree with that. Safe to say, I think the way the planning system operates is that it does allow local authorities, indeed all levels of government, to effectively to refer decisions upwards if they don't like them. And then the decision ends up being made by central government and they dither. I mean, that is the risk that and I think that there's there isn't, of course, a consensus about the future of Heathrow Airport. But I think there's a sort of consensus in Britain about Britain continuing to have a hub airport, or if there isn't, we should at least decide to export the growth to France and Germany. If we want to export the jobs and growth to France and Germany, let's make a positive decision to do it, and then gear up our airports to have little feeder services across to Frankfurt and Charles de Gaulle and Schiphol to do it that way. And I think articulating the debate slightly more in that way would make it a clearer decision about what we're trying to do here.
I think there's a second point, which I think was in the question, and that is the need to engage with the communities in which you operate. And certainly at British Land, we took a decision a couple of years ago that it was essential for us to engage with the communities in which we operate, either as a developer or as an owner and operator of real estate. And I think that certainly for us, that's something that's now built into the system. We have a charter, a bunch of commitments that we make, and they're real commitments, and we've stated them very publicly. And two things. I think the feedback that we've had from those communities has been very positive, and also some of the real effects, you know, in terms of committing to create apprenticeships in places and those sorts of things, I think have had real benefits. So I think that is part of the shifting face of how operating in the built environment has to be if we are going to properly engage and get in the right direction. But that is a mind shift, which by no means everybody has got to yet.
Right, it's 10:30, and possibly people would like to now get together and chat about what they've heard. I think that's been a very good starter to the morning. Excellent thoughts from our panellists, some real challenges, particularly from Tony at the end there, as to whether we wish to export our growth by ducking some of the big issues going forward. But we've got the rest of the day, no doubt, to continue to debate some of these issues. So please, a round of applause for our panellists. Thank you.